Wait a minute. We're going to adjust the volume. Good morning, everyone. Better? How about like this? Like this? We want to hear and not break eardrums. Better? Okay.
That's good.
I'm Peggy Flynn. I'm the co-president of the Democratic Women's Club, along with my good friend and colleague, Carol Fuller, who's back there still hauling chairs. We only have a few announcements and then we'll get to our main speaker, our one and only speaker today. Thank you to everyone who has recently joined. Thank you to our new members. If anybody's interested in joining our board or any of our committees, see Carol or I afterwards. And there's a form. This is our third hybrid meeting, so welcome to everybody online. Thank you for joining that way. I have just one announcement to read and then we'll get going. This Wednesday, and before I start, I'll say that there's a link in our chat for everybody online to look at. This Wednesday, there's a Zoom meeting on the DWC supported library affordable housing project. You can just go to the city website, cityofsantacruz.com, mixed use library. But even if you're here, you can look at it later. Just go to the city thing, and it's on. It's going to include city staff, project architect, and affordable housing developer, providing current and accurate information on the library affordable housing project that the DWC has already supported and endorsed. And so this is one of our favorite meetings because there's not so many ballots this time on the November ballot, but so, it's confusing and, who's doing what and who's supporting what. And so from the wilds of the West Side, we have State Senator John Laird to go through the November ballot for us. John.
Thank you, Peggy. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm pleased to do this, and I was trying to figure out how long I've been doing it. I think I've been doing it for 14 or 16 or 18 years. And I finally thought, okay, I'm working 14 hours a day. I don't have time to research these, but here I am and ready to do it. And before going through this is being taped. And if you're watching this afterwards, I'm going to go through the 7 propositions in order. So if you're interested in one in particular, you can fast forward 1/7 for each proposition and hope to get somewhere near where the proposition is that you want. And at the end, I'll actually add some additional resources if you possibly could want some more information about some of these propositions. And the headlines about this year is there are just 7 propositions. But when I did this the last 2 times, there were 12 and there were 18. And this is the fewest propositions to be on a general election ballot since 1960, which I don't think anybody here remembers. And the headline also is at least one of these 7 will sound familiar. You voted on a version of it twice before in recent years. Another one is a bill that passed the legislature and opponents got the signatures to send it to the ballot and make the people vote it up or down. Another is a constitutional amendment that was put on the ballot by the legislature. And the 2 highest profile ones, the ones that everybody asks me about all the time, are the 2 sports betting ones that hopefully I will get to the bottom of for you so you will understand it. And there's an issue there. What happens if both of them pass? And I will briefly address that. And for the first time in recent times, there are no bond issues on the ballot. I think we were so flush in the budget that people didn't feel the need to go to the voters for money. And one of the reasons, let me talk about maybe 3 reasons there are fewer ones on the ballot, because they all will reflect on these measures. One of the reasons is that in the 2018 election cycle, the voter turnout was very low. And to qualify for the ballot, the threshold of signatures is based on the previous election, a percentage of the turnout in the previous election. So when the turnout was really low, it was easier to qualify initiative because you had a lower threshold. In 2020, we had the Trump election where every person in the universe voted. As a matter of fact, somebody came up to me at an event like this and said, "You just got more votes for the state Senate than had ever been received previously in a state Senate election. But you should know that there were 5 more senators that got higher votes than you." So there were 7 of us that broke the record for vote totals in a Senate election in 2020 because the total was so high. So one of the reasons there are less propositions is it was much more expensive and difficult to qualify because the signature thresholds were high. Another reason is that in 2014, a ballot measure was enacted that allows people to remove propositions from the ballot before the deadline if they have a reason to do it. 2 were done in this, and it was because compromises were reached in the legislature on the subject of what was submitted. The first one was the medical malpractice insurance cap. The acronym is MICRA. And in 1975, there was a cap that you couldn't recover more than $250,000 in damages from a medical malpractice case. That cap was never indexed for inflation, so its value in the years since then plunged, and people in the medical community loved it. People in the legal community hated it, and gradually people were not getting representation on medical malpractice cases. So somebody qualified an initiative that would have really blown up the cap. And as a result, the California Medical Association and the consumer attorneys did an elaborate negotiation that allows the cap to move up gradually over the next few years. And when I was a principal co-author of that bill. Once we enacted it into law, the person withdrew the proposition. And even though this isn't about the propositions, for your amusement, I was asked by one of the players to have a bill ready in case they had an agreement. And in the jargon, it's known as a spot bill. So I had this bill that in this section of the code would change the font size of the printed code. And everybody kept saying, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And I didn't want to tell them they're negotiating on medical malpractice. I hope if there's a solution, it substitutes in for the font bill. And then they ended up using a different bill, and I got this bill all the way over to the assembly, and my ledge director was like, "Let's send it to the governor. Let's have some fun." But in the end, I think it became a sea level rise bill. So it's all good. And the second one was having to do with plastics. And there was a ballot measure that would have required certain kinds of fees on single-use plastics and other things. And the plastics industry negotiated with an environmental senator, and there is now an extended producer responsibility bill on plastics. And when that was agreed to and the governor signed it, the person pulled back the initiative. So that is another reason why there are limited ones there. And then the other thing that happened is that people were in the process of getting signatures, but they didn't get them in time. So amazingly, we already have 4 initiatives that have qualified for the 2024 ballot. But we're not even to the 2022 ballot, and 4 have qualified. One is one that the legislature put on, because there's this thing from the early 1960s that if there's a public housing project, people have to vote on it. And that was considered discriminatory. And even the realtors, the original sponsors, now support the measure to repeal that. There's one that would increase the income tax for individuals over $5 million and dedicating it to pandemic response. There's one that would raise the minimum wage to $18 an hour by 2026. A third would repeal the Private Attorneys General Act, PAGA, replace it with a new law. And this is gonna make you all wince. The fifth one, where they're counting the signatures right now, has been submitted by gambling interests for sports betting, figuring that these initiatives that I'm about to talk about could well fail, and they'll have an initiative on the ballot again in 2024 on this, which I'm trying to look for the right word. It sort of makes me want to throw up. I can't believe that we're going to have that happen. And so today, my goal is to present both sides of the propositions, let you know who the key constituencies are. One of the telling things is who the major donors are for each side. Talk about newspapers and how they have weighed in on different sides. And the one thing is, and I know this will be repeated, the campaign contributions and newspaper endorsements are a moving target. And there were a number of newspapers that just weighed in this week, and I kept adding it to my notes and adding it to my notes. And I'll give you if you're really interested, a way to do it. So without any further ado, I'll get to the propositions. And the last one that the voters voted on the last time was Proposition 25. So it starts with Proposition 26, with one exception, and that's that the legislature put on a constitutional amendment with regard to reproductive rights and named it Proposition 1. So the first one you will face is Proposition 1. And the general summary is that the Supreme Court acted earlier this year in the Dobbs decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, and the legislature responded with a constitutional amendment sponsored by the Speaker and the Senate President to enshrine reproductive rights into the state constitution. It passed the Senate 29-8. It passed the Assembly 58-17. And it was done by the deadline of June 30th to be placed on the ballot. In the interest of full disclosure, this is the one place where I've clearly weighed in. Mark Stone, our assembly member, and myself were co-authors of the constitutional amendment when it was placed on the ballot. And so, and it's an interesting procedural thing, because when Roe v. Wade was overturned, there is no federal law in place. So it left it to the states. And now we see every state rushing to figure out what they're going to do. In California, in 2002, Senator Sheila Kuehl, Senator Kuehl at the time, realized that California's law on abortions was the Ronald Reagan Therapeutic Abortion Act that was enacted in the early 1970s. Parts of it were unconstitutional. Parts of it were so outdated that what Sheila did is she introduced a law that basically said, we're going to codify our existing practices in California under Roe v. Wade. And so that was passed. Then Governor Gray Davis signed it into law. And there was a concern at the time that then George W. Bush, who was appointing Supreme Court justices, we're going to appoint justices that overturn Roe v. Wade. So it's like, let's be ready with a strong law in place if that happens. And fast forward to now, it actually happened, much to the consternation of many people. And it was viewed by the legislature that this law wasn't enough, that as good as it is, and as much as that Roe v. Wade defaults to that law in California, let's put it in the Constitution and make sure it is protected as a constitutional right in a way that only the people, if they ratify that amendment, could overturn it in any way. And I think that so Senate Constitutional Amendment 10 became Proposition 1, and it says in the California Constitution that the state cannot deny or interfere with a person's reproductive freedom, and that people have the fundamental right to choose. And this has to do with abortion, and it also has to do with contraception. So that is on the ballot. And then one update note, and that is, as many people here, and I know people will be viewing this later, so at the time this is filmed, in front of the Democratic Women's Club, because I know we don't have a banner. I will remind everybody that that's who is meeting today. Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina proposed a federal law that would outlaw abortions. Now, if that passed, there's a case that it could overrule the states because the federal government would be occupying the field. So it means it's very important what happens in the midterms with regard to what the outcome here. And for those of you that aren't schooled in the whole notion of preemption, it's if a government, generally at the federal level or state level, hasn't occupied the field, then those rights are delegated to the lesser jurisdiction. And I faced this on the Santa Cruz City Council in the 1980s because we had, if you can believe it, we had somebody in Santa Cruz fired for volunteering with the Santa Cruz AIDS Project at the time. And so I introduced a law that says there's a non-discrimination policy based on HIV status. And we had to have closed sessions, and I think I'm safe because it's 35 or 37 years later in disclosing the closed session. There was a big debate about whether or not the state occupied the field and that we couldn't adopt that locally or have it sustained because the state had considered the law and they couldn't pass it. But it was sort of a statement that they were occupying the field. In the end, we adopted the law and it stuck. But that's the issue that's at play here. If the federal government does it, there's a case that they have occupied the field. And the real trouble we have many times, it happened with the tailpipe emissions, is sometimes the federal government will adopt a weaker law than California to preempt a stronger law in California. So this constitutional amendment would enshrine it. We all have to keep our eyes on what's going on at the federal level. And then the interesting thing is the money. So there's an individual donor that has donated $500,000 for in Quinn Delaney. Planned Parenthood Advocacy of Los Angeles, $500,000. Planned Parenthood affiliates, a committee for Yes on One, $275,000. Then interestingly, the California Federation of Teachers Action Committee, $250,000. The California Teachers Association Action Committee, $250,000. ACLU of Northern California, $250,000. Planned Parenthood of Orange County and San Bernardino, $200,000. And interestingly, and this might reflect on a later ballot measure, Lyft has donated $150,000. And the California Medical Association has donated $150,000. And no committee, excuse me, no committee in opposition has raised enough money to report. So at this point, it's just those people in favor. And the ballot measure arguments have been signed by somebody from the California Medical Association, Planned Parenthood Advocates, League of Women Voters, the president of the California Nurses Association, a chair of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and a faculty director at UCLA Center on Reproductive Health, Law, and Policy. Those that have signed a ballot measure in opposition are an individual gynecologist, somebody from the International Faith-Based Coalition, Assembly member Jim Patterson, who is a Republican from Fresno, generally one of the more conservative members of the legislature, somebody that's the executive director of the California Alliance of Pregnancy Care, and the president of the Pacific Justice Institute. Of the major organizations that have taken a position, the California Democratic Party and the California Labor Federation are in support. The Republican Party is in opposition. The Chamber of Commerce has taken no position. And of the few newspapers that have made an endorsement thus far, all of them have been in favor. There has not been anybody in opposition, and that includes the LA Times, East Bay Times, the San Jose Mercury News. So that is the constitutional amendment. That is Proposition 1, reproductive rights. Now to the main event. Proposition 26 authorizes new types of gambling and initiative constitutional statutory amendment. And it's what most people ask me about. And both propositions 26 and 27 are about legalizing sports betting in California. A record amount will be spent on these ballot measures. It's estimated that $400 million will be spent on these ballot measures by election days. And so there's been a deluge of advertising, and it's a battle over what would be this industry. So I'm going to do something I don't usually do. I'm going to try to talk about these two together because it makes more sense. There's even some committees that are for one and against the other as a committee. And it's also one of the rare situations where, because the advertising at the time we do this forum has been running for so long, there's a chance to ground truth some of the claims in the advertising, which, since I can see people nodding in the room, they clearly have seen some of this advertising and know what I'm talking about. And the underlying issue here is that betting on sports has not been legalized in California. A Supreme Court decision allowed for this a few years ago. 35 of the 50 states have legalized sports betting. 5 of these states have done it by initiative, and California is one of the 15 states that has not legalized it. There's no requirement that sports betting be legalized, but given the trends nationally, it's probably an inevitability that in some form, at some point, it's going to come to California. And what we have here is 2 initiatives that legalize sports betting in a completely different way. And that is what is in front of us. And I think as a result, each has different supporters, each has different arguments to make. And the key underlying fact is that a ton of money will be raised from this. 90% of the money will go to whoever operates the system. 10% of the money will go to either public taxes or public purposes. So when I get to it in a minute, when it says, oh, end homelessness, and I'll talk about that as a truth moment. When it says end homelessness, vote yes on Prop 27, they're talking about the fact, and they're not talking about the 90% that goes to the card companies that would run it. They're talking about the 10% that would be distributed, and part of that would go to homeless services. And then, as I said earlier, when I'm done, I'll speculate what happens if both pass. And I think it was even hard for me to understand some of these, and I've reread everything about it. But I think at the top level, it's very understandable. And there's actually, I learned about places I never knew. There's a web page called Sports Handle, which is the web page about online gambling, sports betting, that just describes it. And they had, I thought, generally the best brief description of each initiative. So Proposition 26, they describe as the tribal initiative, retail only sports betting in California. And they say a group of tribes in California work together to get the California Sports Wagering Regulation and Unlawful Gambling Enforcement Act ready for the ballot back in 2021. Generally speaking, it's a pretty restrictive sports betting solution. If approved, it would legalize sports betting at in-state California tribal casinos and horse tracks. This initiative would only cover in-person betting. You would have to bet in person at these locations. It does not allow for any sort of legal online or mobile sports betting in California. To bet, you would need to visit a licensed California tribal casino or racetrack. Proposition 27 was described by the board handle as the online initiative. It's mobile sports betting throughout California. And so a team of major US sports betting companies that includes the likes of FanDuel, DraftKings, And BetMGM has thrown their collective weight to the tune of $100 million behind the California Solutions to Homeless and Mental Health Support Act. If it's given the go-ahead, this online focused initiative would legalize online sports betting across the state of California. Each online sports betting platform will be tied to a California tribe for licensing, but there is no retail in-person betting. It only legalizes online sports betting. And under this proposal, the majority of the tax income from the online sports betting would be earmarked for assisting the state's rising homeless population. It's estimated that hundreds of millions of dollars would be raised for that purpose. So then you get into the specifics of each initiative. The Proposition 26 would allow, and the interesting thing about Proposition 26 is there's this little provision in there that doesn't necessarily relate to sports betting. It actually says that it would allow federally recognized Indian tribes to operate roulette, dice games, and sports wagering on site on tribal lands if authorized by gaming compacts approved by the state. It would allow sports wagering at certain horse racing tracks in 4 counties for persons 21 or older. It would have a 10% tax on sports wagering profits at these tracks directed to the general fund, problem gambling programs, enforcement, and it would also prohibit the marketing of sports wagering to persons under 21. And there would be a whole requirement on the racetracks about in person. There'd be a whole requirement on tribal casinos about how they choose to do it. And the legislative analyst said that there's increased state revenues reaching the tens of millions annually. There's probably increased costs to regulate in-person sports betting, probably reaching the low tens of millions. There's increased state costs to enforce gambling laws. And it would add a new enforcement method, and it would set up a fund that would specifically take these tax revenues for distribution. And the key thing about that fund, and it's true with both of these initiatives, is they would do it in a way that the schools would get their share of the new tax revenue. This is an important thing because it's going to come up in both of these and it's going to come up in a later initiative. Under Proposition 98, which the voters adopted about 25 years ago, roughly between 40 and 50% of the state budget is immediately moved to K through 14 education. So anytime a new tax is enacted, unless there's an exclusion, it'll go for whatever purpose, but 40 to 50% of the revenue from that new tax will go to the schools. And so when Jerry Brown did his increase in the income tax, 40 to 50% of that increase went to schools. And so that is a key thing, because you'll find in one of the later initiatives that the California Teachers Association opposes the initiative. And it's because they do a new tax and it goes 100% for the purpose of the tax. They don't allow the part to go to schools. So that's what's key. Both of these gambling measures didn't want to pick a fight with education. So both of them have a certain amount able to be skimmed off for education off the top. And it requires the use I talked about. Then you get to Proposition 27, and it would legalize the online betting. It would, but here's their interesting twist. The wagering may only be offered by federally recognized tribes and eligible businesses that contract with them. So it is expected that these big businesses that support it, that are betting, like FanDuel, they will have to find a tribe, and it appears that each of the 3 big ones have found a tribe. So 3 tribes are in this because they are sponsoring the sports betting companies. And then that allows the online betting. And the proposition, interestingly, allows betting on athletic events such as football games, And some non-athletic events, such as award shows and video game competitions. But it bans betting on certain other things like high school games and elections. So I'm really glad that we're not going to have a potential Black Sox scandal in elections because somebody's going to throw an election to win a bet. That is excluded. And so then there's the tribes that contract to do this. And it requires tribes to give up some of their rights under federal law to get a license. Tribes must agree to a certain amount of state regulation. And whenever there's a reference, and there was one I talked about in the first one, that compacts have to be amended. For a tribe to operate gambling in California, they're on sovereign lands, they can do it, but they have to enter into a compact with the state that has to be, it is generally negotiated by the governor, approved by the legislature, signed by the governor. And those have been historically controversial in different ways, because when I got to the legislature, there were some people that referred to good tribes, and they were the ones that would adhere to local land use regulation, work on water issues, negotiate with unions and make sure that their workers could be represented by unions, and they would be good neighbors. And then others weren't. There would just be, and I'm not disparaging them, they just made a choice to maybe deposit a certain amount of money and then realize the money. And all of that was decided by compacts that were negotiated. And if either of these ballot measures are approved, there'll probably have to be renegotiation of some of the contracts to include what is there. Once again, they take of the revenue that doesn't go to the operator, the roughly 10% or whatever the percent is that would go to the public entities, 85% would go to address homelessness and gambling addiction programs. And 15% would go to tribes that are not involved in online sports betting, because there are different procedures in California for how some of the tribal gambling revenue is distributed to tribes that do not have casinos. That would be part of this. And the interesting thing, as somebody that in my day job is an appropriator of state funds, normally we would be the ones that would appropriate the revenues that comes to the state. This initiative appropriates them to homelessness. And the other significant thing is that there's not a maintenance of effort requirement. And in the jargon, what that means is that if we had 500 million for new homeless money, it doesn't mean that we couldn't lower the existing state appropriation for homelessness by 500 million. So you'd get new money, but it wouldn't affect the overall outcome. There's no maintenance of effort requirement here. And it really does take away whether there should be a look of all revenues together and an appropriation of all revenues together. This would make the decision that that is where the money goes. And as I was saying, this would also make sure that schools got their share, their original share of the money. So both Prop 26 and Prop 27 do that. So if you summarize these two together, each sets up sports betting in California for the first time. Proposition 26 would be in person at tribal casinos or racetracks. Prop 27 would be only online betting with a few tribes and gaming companies operated. The bulk of the revenue would go to the operators of the online betting. The remaining revenue in Prop 26 would go for regulatory costs, mental health programs, and state revenues. For Prop 27, it would go to homeless services primarily and some of the other small things that I mentioned. And both initiatives would consider revenue state purpose for the purpose of complying with Proposition 98 in schools. So those are the two initiatives that are in front of us. And it has been cutthroat between the two initiatives. And so if you look at who's given the money thus far, this validates some of the things I've just been saying. There's one committee that is called Yes on 26, No on 27, Coalition for Safe, Responsible Gaming, sponsored by California Indian Tribes. It has raised $118 million. Great Rancheria, which is just south of Santa Rosa, has done 32 million. Pachanga in Southern California has done 27 million. The Yochadehi Wintu Nation, which is Cache Creek in the Capay Valley, has done 22 million. Agua Caliente, which is down in the Coachella Valley primarily, has done 11 million. Verona, which is in San Diego County, has done 11 million. And then there's 5 more tribes that are among the top 10 contributors. And then there's a committee against Proposition 26 that is titled No on the Gambling Power Grab. And it's a committee of local community leaders, licensed card clubs and their employees, law enforcement and local interests. And the major people that have contributed the $7 million there are Night Adventures, Park West Casinos, PG Gaming, like Hollywood Park Casino, Hawaiian Gardens Casino, and its existing sort of card club casinos. Then there is a committee that has done $38 million against Proposition 26, titled Taxpayers Against Special Interest Monopolies, a committee sponsored by licensed card clubs. And that is some of the same ones, but it includes the big ones. California Commerce Club, Hawaiian Gardens Casino, Park West, Night Adventures, Garden City, Artichoke Joe's is in for $1 million. So and then there is the Yes Committee on the next initiative, 27, and they call it Californians for Solutions for Homelessness and Mental Health Support, a coalition of housing and mental health experts, concerned taxpayers, and digital sports and information and gaming companies. They have raised $157 million. And that includes the big companies that I mentioned earlier. FanDuel, 31 million, DraftKings, 26 million, Penn National Gaming, 25 million, something that I don't know, FBG Enterprises, it's clearly gaming, it's 25 million. And then there's a few more. Then there's the Committee for No on 27, Californians for Tribal Sovereignty and Safe Gaming. And it is raised 66 million. And it's a lot of the people that are for and sponsoring Prop 26 that are opposing Prop 27. And of the 66 million, the 2 biggest contributors are the San Miguel Band of Indians at $53 million and the Rincon Band of Mission Indians at $10 million. So that's the money that we know about, and it's still coming in major ways. So you can see that it's many tribes for 26, many card clubs and casino interests against 26, the same card clubs and people for 27 and 3 tribes. And then against 27 is the whole host of interests that are for Prop 26. So right now, rather than having a debate about whether we should do sports gaming, it has devolved to what is the best alternative between these two for sports gaming. And even though I'm doing my best to be even-handed, one of the interesting things is some of the editorials in newspapers in just the last week, the LA Times, the Santa Cruz Sentinel, they just have come out against both. And that's sort of what is an emerging trend. And so then now you look at some of this advertising that you are all seeing. There's a claim that tribal leaders urge you to vote yes on Prop 27. And the reality check is yes, there are some tribal leaders for Prop 27. That means 3. But the No on 27 campaign has more than 50 tribes in opposition. There's the claim that Proposition 26 does nothing for disadvantaged tribes, the tribes that don't have casinos. And the reality is that it's technically accurate, but there's existing agreements that take the revenue and distribute it to it, and it would go quite likely into those agreements. And some tribes supporting Prop 26 have promised to share 15% of net sports gambling revenues with non-gambling tribes. And then the campaign against Prop 27 says it would transform every cell phone, laptop, tablet, and video game console into a gambling device, which would lead to more addiction, financial ruin, and homelessness. And every cell phone and laptop already is a potential gambling device. They're just not placing right now legal bets. they're doing illegal bets. And an industry analyst was quoted as saying millions of Californians are betting billions a year on sports. And by definition, that activity is flowing exclusively on unlicensed regulators and through electronics. And there's another thing that I mentioned earlier where Prop 27 says end homelessness. Vote yes on 27. And that's one of those ones my spouse always says to me when I talk back to the TV ads. He always says, they can't hear you. They can't hear you. And I always say, if you could have a ballot measure to end homelessness, I would have done it already. It's hard to believe that one ballot measure can do it, but it does allocate a significant amount of the non-operator revenue of that 10% to homeless. And then you go to the individuals, and that's interesting because on Proposition 26, there's none of the major traditional ones are in support. The Republican Party opposes, the Democratic Party is neutral, and the California Labor Federation has no recommendation. If you go to the newspaper positions on Proposition 26, the only newspaper in California that I have found that has endorsed either one is the Bay Area Reporter, the LGBT newspaper out of San Francisco. And then on Prop 26, opposing it are the San Jose Mercury News, East Bay Times, the Santa Cruz Sentinel, the Los Angeles Times, the Orange County Register, the Riverside Press Enterprise, Los Angeles Daily News, and the Long Beach Press Telegram. On Proposition 27, the second measure, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party oppose it. The Labor Federation has no recommendation. And there is still the Bay Area Reporter in support. There are still similar newspapers, but fewer, the Mercury News, the East Bay Times, the Santa Cruz Sentinel, and the Los Angeles Times in opposition. So hopefully this discussion has made it a little clearer about what these initiatives are, because I don't think you would get it from the TV ads. And now that you've heard about both of them, the other question is what happens if they both pass? Because they are both in a similar thing. And if one passes and the other doesn't, no problem. The one that passes goes into effect. If they all pass and don't conflict with each other, they go into effect. But if more than one pass and they are in conflict with each other, the one that passed with the higher margin of yes votes goes into effect per California's Constitution. And the initiative backed by the card clubs, 27, asserts that it does not conflict with a measure that allows sports betting on tribal lands, and if they both pass, they both go into effect. The measure on the tribes doesn't say anything about it. And so I think the odds are that they go into effect, but the card clubs might have a case for suing the other one. And that is, it doesn't look at this point like that's going to happen, but that it is a thing that could happen if both of them passed. And when we were in the last two rounds, we had some that were just like this. We had two on the same thing, and it really didn't matter which one, because sometimes a controversial initiative that people believe is popular will qualify for the ballot, and somebody will frantically get a second one, try to make it more popular. And because they can't beat that original initiative, but they can beat it if they get another initiative that gets more votes. That's not happening this time. And it's only going to be a few attorneys that may allege it if both of these pass. So that's longer than I think I've ever taken on any initiatives. Anytime I've done this, but it's the thing that everybody walks up out of a crowd and asks me about. So now you know. Then Proposition 28 provides additional funding for arts and music education in public schools. It's an initiative statute. And it's interesting because it would require the state to allocate general fund revenues in the equivalent of 1% of the Proposition 98 education funding guaranteed for public school, which is Prop 98 guarantees money for public schools, K through 12 and community colleges in the state budget. And it would guarantee this 1% for arts and music education. Right now, that's estimated to be roughly a $1 billion a year set aside. And students with a higher proportion of low-income households would get more funding. Schools would require to spend 80% of the new funding on hiring arts and music instructors. They have to publish annual reports. And the interesting thing here, I had to reread it 2 or 3 times because I couldn't tell initially if it was earmarking the 1% from the Proposition 98. It's not. It's earmarking it from the general fund, and they're just indexing it to the amount in Prop 98 to know how much general fund will go for this purpose. And there's been, I think, great concern that whenever their budget cuts, arts and music go first in schools, and this is guaranteed to provide a ready revenue source. And it provides that if the school's budget is ever reduced, because there's like a great recession or something that happens again, that this amount would be reduced proportionately to how the school budget is reduced. So it'd still be there, but there'd be a measure to reduce it proportionately. And it distributes funding based on a formula. And it'd be based on enrollment. There 30% of the formula would be based on low-income students. And it requires the funding to be used primarily to hire new art staff, does education programs. It also provides a little for training and art supplies, but it allows the school principals basically to decide how to spend the money. So while it sort of earmarks how it's appropriated, a little bit about where it goes, then the school principal of each location is the one that gets to decide. So the ballot argument 4 was submitted by the president of CTA, the president of PTA, and Austin Buechner. His title is chairman of Californians for Arts and Music in Public Schools, but he's a very wealthy businessman that happened to have been hired and served 3 to 4 years as the superintendent of the Los Angeles school system. So that was a unique thing at the time, a wealthy businessman that came in and ran the schools. And he argues that only 1 in 5 schools in California has a dedicated teacher for traditional art programs like music, dance, theater, and art. And that this is important. A Los Angeles school board member, Monica Garcia, says Black and Latinx students comprise 61% of pre-K to 12 enrollment in California, 77% in low-income communities. This is a door of opportunity. No ballot argument was submitted against, but the Santa Cruz Sentinel, the San Jose Mercury News, and the East Bay Times have opposed. And the Santa Cruz Sentinel called it the latest case of ballot box budgeting, $1 billion off the general fund done by the voters. And the Mercury News and East Bay Times say per student expenditures adjusted for inflation are the highest since 1988, yet for some there's never enough. They asked to reject the ballot box voting. And we have been very lucky. In my time in the assembly, we had horrible budget situations and we were doing triage all the time with running deficits. And when there was ballot box budgeting, it meant that anything that wasn't covered by initiative was most vulnerable. And that generally meant University of California, California State University System, CSU, state parks, there were certain things in the budget weren't protected, and so when you had a downturn and you had protections, the cuts were aimed at those places. And even though this is $1 billion in a budget that is over a couple of $100 billion, it is that principle. So I think the real decision here is, are arts in the schools important enough to earmark $1 billion, or is there concern about ballot box budget? That is what that one. And if you look at the money, Austin Buechner, the former superintendent businessman, has donated $4.2 million. The Fender Musical Instruments Company is the second one, and they've donated $1.1 billion. California Teachers Association, $1 billion. Connie and Steve Ballmer, the people that he was the CEO of Microsoft, he's $1 billion, and it goes there. And no opposing committee has raised enough money to qualify as an opposing committee. And the Republican Party is neutral. The Democratic Party and the California Labor Federation are in support. The Bay Area Reporter, Los Angeles Times, and San Francisco Chronicle are in support. The San Jose Mercury News and State Time and the Santa Cruz Sentinel are in opposition.
Money $1 billion means to our state budget.
The question, and normally I'm not taking questions, but I expect to get some qualifying ones. And I'm not sure that people could hear that, but it's what does $1 billion mean in the budget? I think the general fund, I'm losing track of the number. It's between 200 and 210 right now. So it is 0.5% of the general fund budget. And when we had the Great Recession, the general fund had been something like 102 billion before, and it plunged to 82 billion in the Great Recession. And so there was a 20% plunge, and it shows how the economy has done so well in the decade since then that the general fund has roughly doubled in that time. So it's as much a function of the ups and downs as it is the proportion. But thank you for the question. And then Proposition 29 is the one that you have seen in a different form before. It requires on-site licensed medical professional at kidney dialysis clinics and establishes other state requirements. It's an initiative statute. This is the third measure to try to deal with this issue. There was one in 2018 and one in 2020. And the Service Employees International, United Healthcare West, UHW, has basically mounted a campaign against private for-profit dialysis companies. And I think two of them, DaVitas and Fresenius, have 75% of the dialysis market in California. And there's a long-standing campaign to unionize them, or hope for. And I think these initiatives have been wedges in that. In 2020, it also sponsored by SEIU, UHW, would have required chronic dialysis clinics to have an on-site physician and other things. It went down with 63.4% no. In 2018, the measure would have required dialysis clinics to issue refunds to patients or patient payers for revenue above 115% of the costs of direct patient care. That went down with 60%. That would have basically legislated a fair rate of return for the dialysis clinic. So this one, from 29, requires clinics to have at least one physician, nurse practitioner, or physician assistant with at least 6 months experience. It requires clinics to report dialysis-related infections to the California Department of Public Health. It requires clinics to provide patients with a list of physicians with ownership interest of 5% or more. It requires clinics to provide the health department with a list of persons with ownership interest of 5% or more in the clinic. It requires clinics to obtain the Department of Public Health's written consent before closing or substantially reducing services to patients. It also would prohibit clinics from refusing to care for a patient based on a patient's form of payment. And So the argument for is that there, and I've mentioned some of the reasons behind it. 80,000 Californians with end-stage renal disease go to one of the 600 commercial dialysis centers in the state, and it's what literally keeps them alive. And these Californians that are dependent on dialysis need to have it done safely, effectively. They also write, don't fall for the corporation's claims that this initiative will create huge costs, harm patients, or create a shortage of doctors. The research director for SEIU says there's so much improvement that can be made. And then the argument against is pretty much the same. I initially put a bunch of statements in, but there's two. One is from dialysis patients that say, this is vital, we need it, don't threaten it. That is really a constant theme. And when we saw the ads for the last two, there were dialysis patients that were making that case. And then the president of the California Medical Association wrote that Proposition 29 would make our growing physician shortage even worse by taking doctors away from hospitals and clinics where they're needed, increasing wait times and reducing capacity to deal with other medical emergencies. And so there is no committee that has opposing this measure that has raised enough money to reach the threshold reporting. That's slightly misleading because I think SEIU raised $8 million to qualify for the ballot. So at least there was $8 million of spending on that side. The committee titled very neutrally, to stop yet another dangerous dialysis proposition, sponsored by patients, doctors, and nurses. DaVita, which is one of the dialysis operators, has donated $52 million. Fresenius, that I mentioned earlier, has donated $27 million, and then some minor amounts from three others, for $86 million in opposition. I haven't seen ads yet, so it leads me to believe that there'll be a big deluge of ads in the weeks before the ballots drops. And so on the for and against, the California Democratic Party supports, California Labor Federation supports, SEIU, United Healthcare West supports, against is the Chamber of Commerce, California Chamber of Commerce, and the California Republican Party. I have not found a newspaper yet that is editorialized in favor of this. All of them, LA Times, Santa Cruz Sentinel, San Jose Mercury News, San Francisco Chronicle, Orange County Register, and others have editorialized in opposition. So even though US voters have seen that twice before, it's slightly different, but it's the same underlying issues as you face it. And then Proposition 30 provides funding for programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by increasing the tax on personal income of people over $2 million. That's in a taxable year. It's an initiative statute. And this initiative has gotten really interesting in about the last 10 days because it would increase tax on personal incomes, as I said, above 2 million by 1.75%, dedicates the revenue to zero emission vehicle subsidies, zero emission vehicle infrastructure, electric vehicle charging, wildfire suppression, and prevention programs. The biggest contributor, and I'll get to the list thus far, has been Lyft. The organization Lyft, they donated $15 million, and this week they added another 10 to it. So, and then, and as you'll hear, there's a coalition of environmental organizations and the Democratic Party that supports. Well, Governor Newsom came out against it, and the California Teachers Association have come out against it. And I was standing next to the governor yesterday because he signed the big climate bill package, and we all went up to Vallejo, and I had one of the big bills, and he signed it, so I'm right next to him. And when he takes questions, one of the first questions is, you're here at an environmental press conference, why are you opposing Proposition 30? And he just doubled down on this point. It's a special interest carve out for one a company, they're using their dollars to get tax dollars to do something that benefits them. The environmental organizations vehemently argue with this and say, and Lyft issued a statement saying the environmental organizations approached us. So that debate has emerged, and the polling shows that it would pass right now, but the polling also shows if there's strong push against it, that support could drop, and the governor has gone on the air as the face of the advertisements against this. So now to get into the actual details of it, as I said, right now, individuals are taxed at a rate of 13.3% at the highest level. And this would add 1.75% for the amount that's over 2 million. And there are a couple of precedents, and Dan Walters wrote about it, I think this morning. Darrell Steinberg in 2004 authored, I think it was Prop 64, and it did a 1% on anybody that makes $1 million or more and dedicates it to mental health. So there has been mental health programs that have come from that. When Jerry Brown did his tax in 2012, it did 1% on the high earners. It was represented as temporary, and then teachers organizations and others came back a few years later and the voters made it permanent. So there's been a couple of precedents for doing the higher level and earmarking it. And the interesting thing, the initiative provides that the tax would end on the earliest of two dates. It would either be January 1st of 2043. So in general, it would be 20 years, or January 1st after 3 consecutive calendar years after January 1st, 2030, where statewide emissions are reduced by 80% of 1990 levels. So it actually would sunset this if there's major emissions reductions. And the interesting thing is that yesterday, the bill signings were about these issues. It was, right now, our goal of 2030 is 40% emissions in a reduction from 1990. AB 32 that was adopted in 2006, when I was in the assembly and I was one of the lead co-authors, it was to put the Kyoto protocols on California after George Bush walked away from them, so that we would go to our 1990 levels by 2020, and that would be a reduction somewhere in the neighborhood of 11%, 12%, 13%, and we met that 2 years early. So that gives you a frame of reference. And in 2018, we were roughly 11 or 12%, give or take, below 1990. We're trying to be 40% by 2030, and we think that's going to be hard. And then, we're hoping by 2045 to get to 100%. So the fact that it would call this off at a certain point is something that is going to be hard to reach. Some of us really want to reach it and want to reach it sooner rather than later. But the way this is tied, the odds are it wouldn't sunset until sometime in the late 2030s if everything went exceptionally well with our climate programs. And so the revenue would be appropriated into the Clean Cars and Clean Air Trust Fund, a zero emission vehicle infrastructure, clean mobility subfund, gas emissions subfund. And I chaired this year in the Senate. We had a really, this was the basis of my comments yesterday at the bill signing. A year ago, we would not have imagined we were doing good things on climate this year. And the one tough environmental bill died on the last day of session on the Senate floor. I floor managed it. It got 14 votes. It needed 21. And yesterday, the governor signed 40 bills. 11 of them came from the Senate's climate working group that I chaired. The biggest one out of the working group, he incorporated into his thing about really setting interim goals to kickstart it as we move along. And we had bills on electric vehicles because there's electricity deserts in poor areas. There's non-incentive for multifamily houses and electric vehicles. And that is the biggest place in our emission sector that we can make gains is in transportation. And so this would kickstart it. It's estimated by the legislative analysts that this would raise $3.5 to $5 billion annually. And the other thing to note is that the state tax system is heavily weighted to really wealthy people. And that is the reason why in the last 2 years, we have had people in the pandemic that are, I don't know, working class, you call them, or disadvantaged, have struggled, that have barely made it, and some haven't made it through the pandemic, while we were having a $75 billion surplus because the people at the top end were doing really, really well in stock returns. And so the state budget is keyed that it overperforms in good times and it underperforms in bad times. And so this tax would really depend on the high wage earners, the highest wage earners continuing to do well. That would be the way it would realize money. And so in the arguments for the organization Spur, that it will finance a bold agenda, it'll only touch a few million people. The communications director for the California Environmental Voters says this goes to the heart of our climate crisis in the state. Bill McGavern, a coalition for clean airs, who I think he's with now, he used to be the executive director of the Sierra Club, talks about protecting the health of Californians. And the argument against is this unique mix of people. There are the usual suspects like the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association that say, this is a raise in taxes. We hate this. There's the California Teachers Association, because this is what I was leading up to in the other discussion about the tribal gaming. This does not allow the schools to get their percentage of this new revenue. So the California Teachers Association opposes this. And then Gavin Newsom is really fingering this as somehow Lyft is going to benefit from this with public tax dollars, and it's a special interest. There is a lot of debate going on about that. And the quotes I had just mirror those organizations in saying that. And so then if you look at who's given money, Lyft is given 50 million and they just added 10. The International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers has given $1 million. And Elect Climate Champions Fund, sponsored by the California Environmental Voters, was given 51. And the CAL FIRE Local 2881, because part of this goes for wildfire fighting, has given 25,000. And then the interesting thing is, in that total 16 million for it, these figures are old. I think it's 10 days or 2 weeks old, and it shows that 2.4 million has been given against, but the news articles in the last 24 hours that show the governor's going up say that something like 7 or 8 million has now been raised in opposition. And to be honest, it's 10 individuals that have given between 50,000 or 100,000, and I do not recognize a single name. I was trying to Google some of them to see if I could get some common theme. I didn't know, is it wealthy people that don't want to pay higher taxes? Is it, are they tied to one of these organizations? I cannot tell. And it gets really interesting when you look at the groups that are for and against. So support, California Democratic Party, Santa Cruz Democratic Party, Representatives Ro Khanna and Barbara Lee, Assemblymember Buffy Wicks, California Environmental Voters, CAL FIRE Local 2881, Unite Here, Tom Steyer, and the Lyft Corporation. And against are the California Chamber of Commerce, the California Republican Party, the California Teachers Association, Jack O'Connell, who's the former school superintendent, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, and Governor Gavin Newsom. And there was one story sometime in the last week where I think the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association guy was quoted, I'm not going to get it exactly right, something like, we never thought we would be agreeing with Gavin Newsom on anything. And so that is out there. And I think this is going to be a real race right down to the wire. The newspapers, Bay Area Reporter supports, San Francisco Chronicle supports, San Jose Mercury News opposed, East Bay Times opposed, Orange County Register opposed, and not many, if there's any other papers, maybe smaller, they've opposed thus far. So that is that measure, and it's really interesting. It's sort of one of those ones like who believes what it is going to be, how it is decided or how people act on it. But it is an environmental measure supported by environmentalists strongly and some union interests that the governor opposes. So it's fascinating. And the phrase double down is overused, but yesterday when I was standing next to him, he doubled down on it. So it was interesting. And then the last measure, Proposition 31, is the one that took a 2020 law enacted by the legislature, signed by the governor. It was Senate Bill 793. It was by then San Mateo County Senator Jerry Hill, and it bans most flavored tobacco products in California. And this bill got enough signatures to be blocked from going into effect, and now it's up to the voters. Do you want this bill to go into effect? And this is one of those where yes actually means yes and no means no. If you want the bill to go into effect, you vote yes. If you don't want the bill to go into effect, you vote no. I'll repeat that later because I think that when the voters overturned the bail law 2 years ago, they were totally confused because I think you had to vote no to get to yes or vice versa. And this one, at least, yes means you support the law, no means you don't. And it prohibits the retail sale of certain flavored tobacco products. And this is one of those where I thought time has passed me by because there were a couple of terms here I didn't understand. I mean, the ones I do understand, it's including but not limited to cigarettes, e-cigarettes, chewing tobacco, and snuff, and tobacco flavor enhancers. But it excludes certain premium handmade cigars, loose leaf tobacco, which isn't intended for making cigarettes, and then the one that maybe a bunch of people know about where time has passed me by. Shisha tobacco products, if sold by a hookah tobacco retailer meeting specified conditions. And you know, better you than me. I do not know what that means, but at least they're excluded. And so the arguments really boil down to whether you believe that flavored tobacco is in fact one of the #1 ways that young people move into tobacco use. That is the heart of the debate. The contention of anti-smoking groups is yes. The contention of tobacco interests are like, come on, it's going to happen anyway, or some version of that. And so the argument for is what I just said, and that it's a hazard to good health. The argument against was, I think, is best represented by an editorial of the Daily Breeze, which is, I think, in the Torrance area in Southern California. And they say a no vote overturns the law. In our view, this is the correct vote, and it's no contest. Banning the sale of flavored tobacco products is based on the premise that banning them is necessary to keep children from smoking tobacco and going down the path of addiction. The premise is nonsensical for the obvious reason that it's already illegal for minors to purchase tobacco products. And I think as many, we are in Santa Cruz, California, where cannabis was only legalized a few years ago. We know very well that the fact that it was illegal did not lead to lower cannabis use in Santa Cruz in that period of time. And so you have to ask if the same premise applies here on this. And it's interesting, the supporters in money, there's almost $6 million that have been contributed to uphold the law and for a yes vote. And the largest contribution, $4.2 million, is from Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York, Bloomberg Industries. And then Kaiser Foundation Health Plan, 1.1 million, California Teachers Association, 250,000, American Cancer Society, 125,000, American Heart Association, 100,000, and then Assemblymember Jim Woods ballot measure. He's chair of the Health Committee, and Jerry Hill for Assembly in 2024, which is probably his remaining money, and he's given 50,000. And it's also very telling who has contributed in opposition, because there's 22 million and almost 21.5 million have been contributed by either R.J. Reynolds Tobacco or Philip Morris. And so that's sort of, for those of you listening on the, people laughed in the room. And I think that I have found through the years, you can explain ballot measures to your heart content. When you say that Philip Morris or R.J. Reynolds were the two biggest contributors, it tells people what they need to know about how this ballot measure is divided. The individuals that are for and against, the California Democratic Party is for this. The California Labor Federation is for this. Governor Gavin Newsom has endorsed this. The California Teachers Association is for this. And the California Republican Party is opposed. Newspapers, Santa Cruz Sentinel in support, East Bay Times, San Jose Mercury News, Santa Rosa Press Democrat, San Francisco Chronicle. Opposed are the Daily Breeze, is the Daily Breeze, which I quoted from already, the Orange County Register, the Los Angeles Daily News, and the Long Beach Press Telegram. So that is actually the 7 ballot measures. And believe me, it's hard to imagine that there's anything that you would want to know that would be more than what I just told you. But if you do, because the newspaper endorsements, the money contributions are still moving targets. And so the California Secretary of State, if you go to the California Secretary of State's website, the official voter guide is online if you haven't gotten yours or you misplaced yours. And they also have the money reported. And they also have a section that usually gives the largest donors for some of them. The Ballotpedia, which is an elections website, if you were to Google Ballotpedia and ballot initiatives, it'll take you and you choose the ballot initiatives, and then they have every state's, but you get to California, it's easy to find, and they have a link to each one, and they post the arguments from the ballot pamphlet. They try to update the money for and against. They try to update the newspaper editorials. They try to update the endorsements. That's a good backdrop. And then there's an organization in Sacramento called Forward Observer, just like it sounds, Forward Observer. And for some reason, I know the owner, Joe Redota, he's a great guy, he has lots of clients, but for some reason, he's obsessed with what newspapers have endorsed in ballot measures. So he has a chart, he updates it every day. You can go to Forward Observer and just see what the newspapers are, if that matters. And so, as I think I mentioned at the beginning, at some point this will be posted online and you'll be able to go through by the measures and find it. That always seems that there's either an update or somebody says you mispronounced a name. And so I always do this thing. That's when it's posted, I do a comment and I try to add whatever it was that somebody corrected. So it's at the comment below there, and I'm officially discharged from my duty of whatever I mispronounced or didn't say. And I would just, and you know, I thought, oh, I'm in the Senate now. I work 14 hours a day. I don't have time to do this anymore, but the DWC didn't accept that. So happy to do it, happy to know. And I hope that if I do this in 2 years, we're not back to 18 ballot measures. So thank you for bearing with my wonky discussion of the 7 ballot measures.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Where our board meets on Monday, we'll be planning our October program. Oh, Carol's shaking her head no. Okay, thank you. I forgot. We'll be planning our October program, and it will be, advertised. And what she wants me to note is that there are yard signs for anybody to take outside. So please feel free to do that. And again, if anybody's moved to join our board or committees, see Carol. Yeah, or me. See Carol.
Where can people find this online?
So it's on our website, the Democratic Women's Club of Santa Cruz County, and it takes us a few days, so don't look until mid or late the week, and then John, as he said, we'll go check. Oh, and he'll post it too. So, yeah, we've recorded it and it'll be there. So thank you, everybody, for coming.